Hello and welcome to these lectures on multi-level explanation. I'm Robin Hendry. I'm a philosopher of chemistry, more generally a philosopher of science, and I've been studying chemistry as a special science for over 20 years now. And part of that study involves looking at how chemistry relates to physics. So chemistry is a prime example of multi-level explanation. Many philosophers and many scientists regard chemical phenomena as being fully explained by more fundamental physical phenomena. So it's exactly the kind of science that is central to debates about multi-level explanation. So let me first start by giving an overall introduction to the lectures. In these three lectures, I'm going to propose that we take a historical walk through the debate on multi-level explanation. It's not going to be an entirely chronological walk, but rather it will be governed by the dialectic of the debate. We'll start in the 1950s and 1960s by looking at an ambitious programme of reductionism that was set within a neo-positivist view of theories. That was associated particularly with Paul Oppenheim and Hilary Putnam, and an influential book by Ernest Nagel. Then in the 1960s, out of this ambitious reductionism grew an influential view in the philosophy of mind, the mind-brain identity theory, sometimes also called type reductionism. Criticisms of the mind-brain identity theory and of the classical reductionism in the philosophy of science gave rise, from the 1970s onwards, to an anti-reductionist consensus. In the philosophy of mind, this took the form of non-reductive physicalism. That is a form of physicalism that rejected the idea that everything could be reduced to the physical, but argued that in some sense everything was grounded in the physical. The physical here is understood slightly more widely than the material to include things which are clearly physical, like radiation and so on, sounds, but which one wouldn't want to say are themselves material. So that was the philosophy of mind version of the anti-reductionist consensus. Slightly later in the 1980s and 1990s, this grew into various forms of pluralism in the philosophy of science. From about 2000, there came an ontological turn. This happened when non-reductive physicalism came under sustained critical pressure that forced many defenders of non-reductive physicalism to choose between the non-reductionism and the physicalism. So the idea was that internal pressures within non-reductive physicalism forced a split. So we have to accept that something exists other than the physical, or we have to accept that everything that really exists can in some sense be reduced to the physical. And in the same time, and in the linked development, this led to the re-emergence of emergentist positions in philosophy, which had been dormant for a very long time, but which had continued to be proposed by scientists within, for instance, complexity theory and within various parts of physics, including condensed matter physics. But let's now do a bit of scene setting. Let me start by explaining the distinction between physics and the special sciences. Special sciences are those sciences that apply to more restricted parts of reality than does physics. Chemistry, for instance, describes the changes that happen in a restricted range of energies and temperatures. So classical chemistry, as conceived by 19th century chemists, for instance, doesn't really apply to goings on within the sun, which are much, much higher temperatures and concern plasma. For instance, that plasma is where matter has been heated up so much that the atoms themselves dissociate into nuclei and electrons. At cooler temperatures, once matter condenses, that's when chemistry as we know it, and the chemical substances we see around us and the compounds and so on, come into being. Biology is yet more restricted because, as far as we know it, the forms of life that we know to exist within a restricted range of temperatures and energies compared to the range at which chemistry can take place. So chemistry can take place at hundreds of degrees centigrade, thousands of degrees centigrade, much hotter than any known form of life can continue. Now, the special sciences each seems to have its own range of entities, that is, things, processes, that's things going on, and events and so on. Some sciences have their laws, and each has their own distinctive range of theories. It's the theories and the laws which provide the explanations, which are going to be the subject of these lectures. It seems that we seem to have different sciences giving distinct and autonomous explanations, each at its own level, as it were. So physics describes things in very general terms of particles, fields, energy, and space-time. Chemistry describes atoms and elements that they make up, molecules that are made up by atoms too, and the compounds that are distinctively identified by the kinds of molecules that they contain. Biology deals with living things, cells, organs, organisms, species, and ecological habitats, and so on. So, within different sciences, theories seem to provide explanations at different levels of both generality and of size and parthood. We'll see a little bit more of that in a minute, because these are the insights that motivate reductionist thinking. So what is it to take a view on multi-level explanation? As I'm going to present it, to take a philosophical view on multi-level explanation is to take a path through the following three questions. Are the explanations offered by the special sciences autonomous, or are they derivative? What does it mean to say that a special science explanation is autonomous, or, on the other hand, derivative? How far, if at all, do the various special sciences, physics, fit together into a single system? And what does it mean to say that? Well, one initial distinction one can make between positions in this kind of debate is between reductionist positions and anti-reductionist or non-reductionist positions. Reductionists tend to argue that there is no multi-level explanation because there are no autonomous explanations given by the special sciences. Special sciences fail to be autonomous because they can be reduced. And what this means is that the layers that they seem to describe, the layers of reality, are in fact nothing but physics. So this is sometimes called nothing buttery. Reductionists view their kind of position as more economical, so it needs to make fewer distinct additional posits about what exists. Anti-reductionism, on the other hand, rejects the idea that special sciences are reducible. It's a less economical picture because it is committed to more different kinds of things, distinct kinds of things. According to anti-reductionists, special science explanations are autonomous in some sense, but there's more than one way that they could be autonomous. They could be autonomous in the sense only of reflecting our different ways of conceiving reality. So it could be our conception of reality which is layered. On the other hand, a form of non-reductionism or anti-reductionism may be more ontological if its view is that the autonomy of the special sciences is deeper than merely an autonomy in our conception, and that the layeredness and the levels are really, in some sense, there in nature. So moving on to today's lecture, this concerns, as I said earlier, an ambitious dawn. This is the formulation of classical reductionism as a programme by Paul Oppenheim and Hilary Putnam, and also by Ernest Nagel. And then we'll go on to look at the three central reductionist cases. These are thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, chemistry and molecular physics, and genetics and molecular biology. We'll then look at some objections to the central cases. Now, these central cases are central to the attractiveness of reductionism, because these central cases are the ones that reductionists put forward to ground their claim that a more general kind of reductionism, in which, for instance, the mind is reducible to the body or the brain, or society is reducible in some sense to individuals and their actions. These wider reductionist programs are made plausible to the extent that there have been successful reductions in the past. So obviously it's important that we look at some objections to these central cases. I'll also look at some general kinds of reductionist response to these objections. I'm going to start by looking at Paul Oppenheim and Hilary Putnam's famous 1958 paper, The Unity of Science, as a working hypothesis. Oppenheim and Putnam argue for their working hypothesis in two ways, as we shall see, by bringing forth direct and indirect evidence that science proceeds by effecting reductions. One important thing to realise about how the classical reductionists view reduction is that it is an intertheoretic relationship. So I said earlier that the different sciences talk about entities and processes, and they also have their own laws and theories. Well, the classical reductions focuses on the laws and the theories rather than the entities and the processes. You might get a view of the relationship between the entities and the processes out of the view, but that would be secondary. So Oppenheim and Putnam give us a layered view of reality, that is, in a very famous diagram that you can see on this slide. They present the things that are talked about in the various sciences in terms of a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is ordered by the relationship of parthood. So at the lower level, we have elementary particles, which are in some sense are parts of everything else. And elementary particles are parts of atoms. Atoms are parts of molecules. Molecules are parts of cells. Cells are parts of multicellular living things, and living things are members of social groups. The converse of parthood is composition. So molecules have atoms as parts. That means that molecules are composed of atoms. Now, this hierarchy, Oppenheim and Putnam analyse in terms of a more explanatory relation between theories or laws. The general idea of reduction that Oppenheim and Putnam start with is that in which we explain a more specific theory or body of knowledge in terms of a more general theory or body of knowledge by showing that the more specific theory or body of knowledge is a special case of the more general one. The great example here would be how Isaac Newton showed that the more specific laws discovered by Galileo and Kepler to govern terrestrial and planetary motions were instances of his own law of gravitation and three laws of motion. What Newton did was to unify terrestrial and planetary motions under a single scheme. So this idea of explaining something more specific can then be applied to the levels. So Oppenheim and Putnam's claim is that we should expect that the theories that apply to the parts of a thing are going to be more general than the theories that apply to the thing itself. So the theories that apply to molecules are going to be special cases of theories that apply to atoms, which might seem quite plausible. Forming molecules is one of the things that atoms do. So we'd expect a theory of the behaviour of atoms to deal with the formation of molecules. So, explaining a theory about the behaviour of some class of entities, e.g. atoms, should be done in terms of a theory about the behaviour of its parts, in this case atoms and nuclei. Their micro-reduction, their idea of micro-reduction is just putting this conception of explanation into practice. So a micro-reduction is the explanation of a theory of a whole in terms of a theory of its parts. So if we see the numbered layers next to us, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, we should expect each layer to explain the one above it, or rather theories about each layer to explain theories about the one above it. So let's consider this hypothesis that Oppenheim and Putnam are asking us to consider, that is, the unity of science. They argue for it through two kinds of evidence. One is direct and one is indirect. But what's the hypothesis? Well, broadly one would put it as the belief that science will proceed by unifying all the different phenomena it studies into a single scheme with different levels connected to each other by micro-reductions to give us this hierarchy. So what's this evidence, the direct and indirect evidence? Well, the direct evidence is reductions actually achieved. So I mentioned earlier thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, the relationship between chemistry and molecular physics, and the relationship between genetics and molecular biology. These are all relationships that are claimed by reductionists to be direct evidence that intertheoretic reductions are possible. But Oppenheim and Putnam agree that that direct evidence is somewhat limited, and then they appeal to more indirect evidence, the indirect evidence being broader reasons that they think there are to think that science will progress via successive micro-reductions. The argument here is rather less impressive. If one wants to be rather brutal about it, one might say that it's in fact rather weak. Their argument assumes determinism, that is the idea that earlier states of the universe determine later states, and they then argue that the evolution of the universe started out with only simple things existing, and then more complicated things came into being. So if the earlier states of the universe determine the later states of the universe, and the later states of the universe contain more complex things, then the complex things must be in some sense determined by the earlier, simpler states of the universe. Well, it's an interesting argument, but it's hardly telling. And of course, the problem is to establish determinism. That's something I'm going to come back to in the final lecture. It's something that philosophers have often discussed, but the scientific evidence for it is rather wanting. I mean, one may have all sorts of a priori metaphysical or theological arguments to accept or reject determinism, but what evidence do we get from the science? It seems rather strange for Oppenheim and Putnam to, as it were, help themselves to the truth of determinism as a way of motivating a hypothesis about how science works. I'm now going to move on to Ernest Nagel's famous book, The Structure of Science, published in 1961. Nagel's book is a classic and rather thick analysis of science in terms of what has now later come to be called the received view of theories. Under the received view of theories, inherited from the positivists, which is why I called it a neo-positivist view earlier on, theories consist of laws as universally quantified statements expressed, best analysed rather, in first order or predicate logic, which have been developed by philosophers and mathematicians such as Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell from the beginning of the 20th century. So if theories consist of statements in a formally analysable language, there is an obvious project of analysing relationships between theories, including relationships such as explanation and reduction, in terms of relationships between these theories as analysed in these formal languages. The emphasis is on formal aspects and on language and on meaning and logical relationships. Another assumption that Nagel makes is that explanation is viewed as deduction. So you may already have heard in other lectures about Hempel's covering law view of explanation. And one aspect of this is his deductive nomological model of explanation, in which to explain an event is to show that it was deducible from a scientific law. So it's to bring it under a scientific law. So for instance, and one could also explain laws that way. So for instance, one might view Newton's explanation of Galileo's and Kepler's laws concerning terrestrial and planetary motions, in each case as deductive. Now, we also saw that, according to Oppenheim and Putnam, reduction is gnomic explanation. But if gnomic explanation is deduction, then it follows that it must be plausible to see reduction as a form of deduction. And this is just what Nagel proposes. Now, if we see reduction in this way, that is, we see reduction as a form of explanation and explanation as a form of deduction, then it gives rise to the following formal questions that Nagel poses. Firstly, he makes a distinction between homogeneous and inhomogeneous reduction. So an inhomogeneous reduction is where the vocabulary of the reduced theory, the theory to be reduced, is not contained within the vocabulary of the reducing theory. In a case of homogeneous reduction, reduction is fairly simple. It's just you simply need to show that the reduced theory is deducible from the reducing theory. But there's a block to this in the inhomogeneous case, because you can't deduce things in vocabularies that you don't have in your language. So you need, in order to connect by logical relationships the language of the reduced theory and the reducing theory, you have to be able to connect their languages. And that means we have to deal with something called bridge laws. Bridge laws, one might think of as vertical connections, vertical linguistic connections between the languages of the reduced and the reducing theories in the hierarchy that Oppenheim and Putnam were discussing. Nagel, in a very thorough analysis, said that there was a question about what the status of the bridge laws should be. Supposing we've got two theories and they appear to talk about different things. So, for instance, Kepler's laws describe the motions of the planets. So Kepler's laws are about the planets and the elliptical orbits that he thought that they moved in. Newton's laws don't mention planets. So you have to somehow connect Newton's laws, which just talk about, in very, very general terms, about forces and how they act on masses, with planets and how they actually move. That turns out to be quite a complicated thing to do, and that's going to be an important part of achieving a reduction in any particular case. Nagel argued that bridge laws can't simply be stipulations. We can't just come along and define the terms of the reduced theory in terms of the reducing theory. That just won't work, he says, because the terms of the reduced theory and the reducing theory, they already have meanings. You can't just willy-nilly go around stipulating meanings. I mean, you know, words mean things. We can't redefine them like Humpty Dumpty. So Nagel concluded that bridge laws must have an empirical basis. As things turns out, the most common way to view bridge laws is in terms of identities. So there are some plausible cases of identities that have been established by science, which connect reduced and reducing theories, what we would think of as reduced and reducing theories. So, water is H2O, that's a famous identity. Temperature is mean square kinetic energy, that's another identity. Genes are bits of DNA, that's another identity. Mental events and feelings and consciousness are identical with brain processes, events, and so on. That's a much more controversial kind of identity that reductionists argue for, taking these other natural science identities as a model. So it's these identities which are going to be at the heart of the arguments for and against reductionism. And what comes next is for us to analyse the three central cases of reduction, and the identities, the inter-level identities, are going to be central to those arguments. So let's begin by looking at the first of our central cases of reduction, that between classical thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. Now, classical thermodynamics deals with thermodynamic relationships between quantities like heat and pressure and entropy at the macroscopic level. Statistical mechanics attempts to provide an explanation of the laws of classical thermodynamics in terms of more basic claims about the motions of atoms. So here are some problems for the idea that thermodynamics can be said to have been reduced to statistical mechanics. Some problems from the literature. Let's take the second law of thermodynamics, which concerns entropy and how entropy tends to increase. According to the classical second law, mixing happens spontaneously in physical systems, and entropy increases when this mixing happens. Entropy must always increase in a system unless some other system is doing work on it to decrease the entropy in it. And this means that the internal structure of the system is less available for doing work on other systems. In statistical mechanics, however, the second law takes quite a different form, and it's possible for entropy to increase through the operation of chancy processes. So on the second law, mixing involves a chancy process in which less likely states tend to evolve into more likely states. So there's more ways for a gas to be mixed than for it to be unmixed. So if we take like a portion of gas and we've got a hot part here and the rest of it's cold, then there's simply more ways for it to be, such that the atoms in the hot part of the gas are spread out into the rest of the gas. So the gas will become more homogeneous from the point of view of its temperature, because the hot gas will mix into the cold gas. But that needn't happen. That's a statistical process. So that's one big difference between the second law in classical thermodynamics and second law in statistical thermodynamics. A second issue, and these are both taken up in Lawrence Sklar's classic book on statistical thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, Physics and Chance. A second point concerns multiple realization. Now, I said earlier that reductionists think of bridge laws as being important empirical discoveries made by sciences that connect higher level terms with lower level terms. So a higher level term such as temperature with a lower level term such as mean square kinetic energy. But Sklar points out that there is multiple realization in temperature. So a gas can have a temperature, and a body of plasma and a piece of vacuum can also have a temperature. And we know this because, according to the classical thermodynamics, those two physical systems can be in thermal equilibrium with each other. And being in thermal equilibrium means they both have the same temperature. So if they can both have the same temperature and the gas can have a temperature, that means the radiation and the vacuum can also have a temperature. But now what is it that we're identifying temperature with? Well, in the gas, we want to say that it's the root mean square kinetic energy. But there's nothing in the vacuum or in the radiation to have that root mean square kinetic energy. So this, the temperature as a state of the physical system must be realized in a quite different way. So if temperature is realized in different ways in gases, and as it turns out, solids and vacuum and in plasmas, then it seems there's nothing in common between the physical states that underlie having the same temperature. So having the same temperature can't be identified with any physical state that those things have. So multiple realization seems to block the kinds of identities that are needed for reduction. And a third objection to reductionism is made out by Paul Needham in a 2009 paper, which is on the reading list. And this is an argument against the idea of these identities, for instance, between mean square kinetic energy and temperature, as underlying interesting deductive relationships. So what do I mean by that? Well, Needham's argument is that we don't start with, when we're making the connection between kinetic energy, the kinetic energy of molecules and temperature as a macroscopic property, we don't start with the kinetic energy of the molecules and then derive the temperature as a macroscopic property. Rather, we start with the macroscopic property and then we construct a statistical distribution, it's called the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, that we attribute to the molecules as the basis for the macroscopic temperature. And that distribution contains within itself a term for the temperature. So that a temperature and the molecular property, the mean square kinetic energy, which remember is a property of an ensemble of systems because it's an average, these are defined in terms of each other. So we don't seem to have an asymmetrical relationship here, and the deduction is, although it's formally a correct one, it's kind of a philosophically uninteresting one because we're not deducing facts about temperature from facts about motions at the molecular level. We're using the macroscopic conception of temperature to construct a description of the gas at the molecular level. And so it's no surprise that that description of the gas at the molecular level contains within it the concept of temperature, because we presupposed it, and that's not an interesting kind of reduction. So Nagel-type deductions may be formally correct, but they're, in an important sense, philosophically trivial. I now move on to the relationship between chemistry and molecular physics, which has been the subject of my own work for about the last 20 years in the philosophy of chemistry. And it's something that Paul Needham, who I've already mentioned, has also contributed heavily to as well. Chemistry and molecular physics are connected in two ways, at two levels of reduction. Chemistry concerns itself with chemical substances like water and sulfur, which is an element, and chlorine and salt and so on, and it proposes compositional relationships between substances. taking some elements, taking some substances elements, the elements of the periodic table, it argues that they are components of all the other substances and analyzes other substances in terms of their composition, in terms of relationships. Now, there is a plausible, I think it's plausible, Needham argues against it in the 2000 paper, What is Water? I think there is a plausible identification of water with H2O. The question is whether this identification is one that's of any use to the reductionist. When we say that water is H2O, we don't say, well, not if we know any science, we don't say that water is simply a bunch of H2O molecules got together. So surely some bodies of water are that way, so we can think of some scattered water molecules, H2O molecules, sitting in a vacuum, and even although they're not in contact with each other in some sense, that's some water. But if you have a glass of water, that glass of water is H2O molecules interacting very strongly with each other, according to the equation you'll see on the slide, in which two H2O molecules come together and they ionize each other. Now, the numbers of H2O molecules that do this are very small, about 10 to the minus 7, so 1 in 10 million or so. But they're very influential on the behaviour of water. So everyone knows that water conducts electricity, and it does so in a way that's anomalous compared to other substances which are similarly structured. Well, that's because of this ionization of water, which means that water is able to transfer charge across itself without anything carrying that charge by something called the Grotius mechanism. So long chains of these charged protonated water molecules flip their protons so that the excess charge on the electron could be regarded as going from one end of the water to the other without actually anything material crossing the water. That's what's called a transport process. So that seems to be an interesting emergent property of the water that it bears. And it's not simply a property of H2O molecules come together. It's H2O molecules interacting in a very strong way in which some of them go out of existence. So that would seem to be a challenge to the idea that water and its behaviour can be reductively analysed in terms of its composition by H2O molecules. The second problem for reduction concerns molecular structure and whether it can be deduced from quantum mechanics. So this is something I've written a number of papers on. Now, quantum mechanics has been applied during the 20th century to explain the behaviour, the chemical behaviour of various chemical substances, and it's done so very successfully. But it's important to realise that that application, in fact, is difficult to analyse in reductive terms. Why is that? Well, when we apply quantum mechanics to molecular structure, we have to apply a Schrödinger equation. Now, the Schrödinger equation, for really quite different substances, you can see two formulae on the left. There's one famous molecule in the middle there, ethanol. It's the active ingredient in Scotch whisky, for instance. And then below it, you'll see a different molecule of a very different substance called dimethyl ether. You'll see they just change by through the position, really, of the oxygen atom. So these two molecules, if you notice, have got the same atoms in a different arrangement. I prefer to call it a structure. But if they have the same atoms in the same in the different arrangements or structure, that means, as things turns out, that they have the same Schrödinger equation. So out of the same Schrödinger equation, we're supposed to be able to derive both the ethanol structure and behaviour and the dimethyl ether structure and behaviour. Now, it's worth saying now that there is no detailed scientific account of how that is supposed to work. It's an ongoing matter of philosophical debate, and it's a foundational issue taken up by some scientists, which if you'd like to read more about, you can have a look at my 2010 paper. And for an overview of this issue, you can see the Weisberg, Needham and Hendry entry on philosophy of chemistry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The third of my central cases, and the last one, is that of the relationship between genetics and molecular biology, and in particular the complex relationship between genes and DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid to its friends. Now, genes are thought of in two ways, and that's an important contrast to make. Failing to make this distinction means we've failed to see some substantive problems about the relationship between genes and DNA. On one sense, genes are functional. So we think of a gene for a particular trait. So we might have a gene for blue eyes, or for anybody who's studied elementary biology, a gene for vestigial wings in fruit flies. So that's one thing. It's a functional notion of a gene, because the gene is identified by the thing it brings about. That is functionally. We'll discuss functionally a bit more in the next lecture. The second idea we have of a gene is an allele, or a stretch of DNA. Now, that's a bit of a molecule. The relationship between these two senses of genes, which are basically the central relationship in the relationship between genetics and molecular biology, it's a complex relationship. It's many to one. So even within different individuals in the same species, the same gene may be realized in different ways, the same functional gene. So the gene for blue eyes might be realized in slightly different ways in different individuals at the molecular level. So that's multiple realization. Remember that multiple realization blocks the identification of the higher level entity or term with the lower level entity or term, because the relationship is one at least of multiple realization with the higher level entity or term corresponding to a few distinct properties or entities at the lower level. More broadly, the relationship between bits of DNA, alleles, and genes for, that is functional genes, is a many-to-many relationship. So any particular stretch of DNA it can have a number of different effects on the development of the organism that it's part of. So one bit of DNA will affect many different, or participate in many different genes for. Likewise, any particular functional gene will be realized by quite a lot of different bits of DNA very often. So typically, the relationship between alleles and genes is a many-to-many relationship, not a one-to-one relationship, if the reduction of genetics to molecular biology was to go through a kind of a smooth and uniform way. So these points are all made by Philip Kitcher in a very famous article called 1953 and all that, referring to a particular aspect of the history of science coming after the discovery of DNA, which Kitcher published in 1984. So he makes these points about multiple realization, and he also says, well, the one fundamental problem in the reduction as well is that at the higher level, there are no biological laws. So one thing you can't be doing is deriving biological laws from chemical laws, because there just aren't any biological laws in the first place. The laws of genetics that Mendel discovered, as Mendel being one of the founders of classical genetics, they turn out not to be laws at all. They have exceptions, and they only apply to very particular cases of heredity. So if there are no biological laws, then that's one kind of reductionist project that can't get going. So this is all argued for in Kitch's 1984 book. For another informative discussion, there's the book by Kim Sterelny and Paul Griffiths from 1999, which has the marvellous title for a philosophy of biology textbook of Sex and Death. So I'm now going to conclude this lecture on classical reductionism by looking at some plausible reductionist responses to these difficulties. One plausible response is for reductionism to retreat from the claim that science will actually achieve these intertheoretic reductions, to the weaker claim that in principle that they are possible. An example of that, there's a famous paper by Weinberg called Reductionism Redux, in which he basically makes this move. Although we can't reduce the high level sciences in practice, well, in principle we can do it. The question is, what does this mean? And what's the evidence for thinking that it's true? There's a very sceptical paper by Tim Crane and Hugh Mellor of 1999, There Is No Question of Physicism. That's a very nice scattergun paper on this kind of reducibility in principle claim. But yeah, let's think about what it's supposed to mean. Weinberg says that current physical theories can't reduce the special sciences, and that's for a number of reasons. One reason is that we don't really know enough about the special science systems to know how they connect to the physical systems. The other thing is that we don't really have enough knowledge about the general physical laws covering the universe to know that the laws that we currently know are universal in scope. Physics tends to find things that exceptions to its current laws. So because we're in a state of limited knowledge, we can expect that we are going to discover gaps in our current laws. And then finally, fundamental laws of physics are very abstract. It's very complicated to apply them to special science systems. So all this means that we find it difficult to apply them and derive the consequences. But still, says Weinberg, in some sense it's principle. In principle it's possible. So what does that mean? That means that there's some future theory that we can't write down, but if we could write it down, we would be able to solve its equations. So this is a theory that nobody has. Now, I once went to a conference involving both scientists and philosophers, and there was a cosmologist there who said that in principle, the state of the universe at the Big Bang explained his choice of breakfast that morning. Now, one might say, that's all very well, you're entitled to say that, but I don't really think that that's a scientific point of view, and I doubt you could give me some really compelling evidence for that claim. So that's, I think, the light in which we can look at these claims of reducibility in principle. Now we can re-identify our reductionism. We can retreat to a bare ontological position and we'll make no claim at all about into theoretic reductions. And this is what Stephen Blundell do and Brian McLaughlin does. They both take identifiably reductionist positions. Blundell likens special sciences to the game of life and says, well, with the game of life, we know that underneath there's a very simple program that's generating some complex behavior, but we understand the algorithm. That's one way of looking at it as a sort of scientist's perspective. McLaughlin retreats into theoretic reductionism and says, well, science is complicated, our knowledge is imperfect, but in some sense, fundamental physics determines everything else. So he's, as it were, taking an ontological relationship of determination, or a metaphysical relationship of determination, to replace the intertheoretic relationship of reduction. So once again, that's a metaphysical move. It's not a scientific one, but one might still ask, well, what's the evidence for it? Because it's a claim about the world as described by the natural sciences. Let's look at the evidence. We'll come back to that kind of point later on. Central to McLaughlin's claim in particular is his commitment to something called the completeness of physics in motivating his view. So part of assessing the evidence for his kind of view involved assessing the evidence for the completeness of physics. As things turned out, I don't think there is any. Now let's move on to the second of our reductionist responses, and this is to correct or eliminate the higher level entirely. So philosophers of science have always thought about different ways of interpreting theories. There's a realist ways in which we take our theories to be true or approximately true descriptions of the world, and then there's instrumentalism, a tradition stretching back to Bishop Berkeley in the 18th century, in which we take scientific theories merely to be convenient ways of making predictions. And we aren't necessarily committed to the existence of the entities and processes that our theories describe, even when they're the best scientific theories we have. So we could say, well, let's not be reductionists at all. We can be eliminativists or revisionists. We should expect more fundamental theories to replace or revise rather than reduce the special sciences. The match between physics and the special sciences may be imperfect. So that means we needn't worry about these failures of reduction, because the failures of reduction just show us how the reduced theory is really, as it were, something we can regard as a merely approximate or even instrumental description of the world. And Craig Callender has a 2001 paper on classical thermodynamics urging that we not take it too seriously. And we shouldn't take it too seriously because it conflicts with statistical mechanics, which is the more fundamental theory there. Moving forward from Callender's view on which classical thermodynamics is approximately true, we might say that special sciences might not even be approximately true. They might be merely useful fictions. So there's a long tradition in chemistry, which I've written about, in which molecular structure is just a model set up during the 1860s by various European chemists to describe the chemical phenomena, but we don't need to take it seriously as a description of how things are. That's drawing on a long instrumentalist tradition in chemistry itself. And then finally, there's Alexander Rosenberg's 1994 book. Rosenberg is what I would call an ontological reductionist, like McLaughlin, who we're talking about. He thinks that in some sense, everything that there is reducible to physics, but that doesn't mean we can actually use the physics to give us useful explanations, and we still need biology to do that. So biology has an instrumental role in giving us useful explanations, and that's Rosenberg's 1994 book. So with that end, we come to the end of this lecture on the ambitious dawn, and we can move on to our next lecture on the anti-reductionist consensus and how it emerged.